All right, so this story from Acts. Did you know that a good full half of the book of Acts is dedicated to the ministry of the Apostle Paul? So the first half is he's not even mentioned. Second half, it's all about him. And for half of that story, Paul is either under arrest or in prison. So for half of his story, he's in prison. Today we begin the portion of the book of Acts in which Paul is either under arrest or in chains or in prison. In fact, the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. So from this point on in the story till the end, he is not a free man. And that got me wondering if we could try to do a little mini sermon series in the midst of this larger series on the book of Acts. My working title for this series is Following Jesus While Imprisoned by the World. And here's the concept. For the next 8 chapters of Acts, Paul has to figure out for himself how to faithfully follow Jesus in less than ideal circumstances. He has to be faithful in prison. He has to learn to preach while he's in chains. He has to try to stay alive in the midst of numerous threats to his life, even facing the powers of nature in the midst of a massive storm at sea. In the same way, all of us are also trying to follow Jesus while navigating forces that are more powerful than we are, and forces that do not have our best interest at heart. In other words, we have to try to live faithfully under less than ideal circumstances and sometimes very difficult circumstances. We have to live faithfully while imprisoned by powers and circumstances we cannot change. So first, let's think about some of the powers and circumstances that imprison us sometimes. Many of us have jobs that are not ideal. Now, of course, we're probably grateful for our jobs and having a decent job that pays the bills, but many people, if they could choose how to make a living, would do something very different right now than what they're doing. People feel sometimes imprisoned by their job or their career. And for many people, that's not going to change anytime soon. Sure, you could make the radical change and take the big risk and follow your bliss and whatnot. But many of us are just going to plug along and make do with what we have. And still, we have to live faithfully and follow Jesus while we work in a less than ideal situation. And this is also true for children in terms of school. Newsflash, most children do not love school. I know, it's not surprising. The great prophet Pink Floyd said, "We don't need no education. We don't need no thought control. All in all, it's just another brick in the wall." And yet, children still have to go to school. Whether it's online school, which has all its own unique challenges now, or back to in-person school someday, children have to figure out, how do I be a good person? How do I live a good life in the midst of these less than ideal circumstances? What about other forces that imprison us? Sometimes it can be family relationships. Some people are imprisoned by a less than ideal marriage or even a harmful marriage. Some people, it's children. You know, we thought children would be fun. We thought it would be a good idea, but they're driving us crazy. For other people, it's caregiving obligations that you might have or siblings that drive you crazy. You know, there's that ancient proverb that says, you can pick your nose and you can pick your friends and you can even pick your friend's nose, but you can't pick your relatives, right? And like our jobs, we are probably grateful mostly for our families. But we also have to try to navigate circumstances and situations that are less than ideal and sometimes painful or harmful, and sometimes that happens in our own families. Some of us are imprisoned by illness, psychological, physical, emotional, but we have to get up every day and live a good life despite the pain and suffering we experience with life. Some are imprisoned by economic circumstances. We don't have enough money to live in the safest neighborhood, or to send our kids to the best schools, or to get quality health care or childcare. Yet every day, we navigate around and amidst these challenges to live as God calls us to live. And then there's those big spiritual forces that imprison us all, the powers and principalities of this present day, as the Bible calls them. The two big ones that we talk about a lot are white supremacy and patriarchy. These are the meta powers that hold us all in chains. These two things, by the way, do not just imprison Black and brown people and women, But white supremacy is a power that harms all people of every race. As human beings, God created us to be equal with one another, so that even the group that has more power in a relationship is dehumanized by that inequality. When we live with unjust power, whether we know it or not, we are being less than God created us to be. The same is true when men have more power than women. Women are dehumanized by that inequality, but so are men. And we can't just snap our fingers and end white supremacy and patriarchy. They hold us in powerful chains. We can work toward dismantling those things and defeating those demonic forces in the world. But in the meantime, while we fight that battle, we have to navigate those forces that imprison us. Now, I know some preachers talk about using God's power to overcome these challenges and claim victory over them and live free because Christ is more powerful than the things that imprison us. And that's all true, actually. And there are times when, empowered by the Holy Spirit, we need to take action to change our circumstances, to end that harmful relationship, to change that career, to get treatment, to confront and overcome the powers and principalities. But there are also times when we just have to live faithfully in the midst of it. We have to live in the midst of the powers and principalities of this world. The Apostle Paul is not free, and he may be in prison for the rest of his life. We don't know what happens at the end of Acts for sure. Yet he continues to navigate a faithful life in his chains, and so can we. So that'll be the overarching theme over the next few weeks, following Jesus while imprisoned by the world. And I won't explain it in as much detail every week, but that's the idea and the foundation. All right, so let's do a quick summary of this chapter 21 of Acts. And then I'm going to lift up one powerful force in particular that Paul has to navigate in this chapter. So Paul leaves Ephesus, where there is a church that he dearly loves. He loves the people of Ephesus, and he heads to Jerusalem. We're told in chapter 21, verse 1, after we tore ourselves away from the church in Ephesus, we set sail on a straight course heading to Jerusalem. If you do have access to a screen and can see the map, the journey that's described in chapter 21 is the dark purple line. So starting in Ephesus, going through the islands here around the coast of Asia Minor, and then all the way across south of Cyprus and landing in Caesarea. Now they do stop for a minute in Caesarea, and they stay at the home of Philip the evangelist. And Paul, and this is somebody that they know and they trust and they love, and everybody there warns him, don't go to Jerusalem. You're going to get in trouble in Jerusalem. Now it's worth noting, in fact, here that one of the people that warn him are some women. It says in verse 9, Philip had 4 unmarried daughters who were involved in the work of prophecy. I always like to lift up these verses, even if it's not directly related to the sermon, because there's so many often quoted misogynistic passages in the New Testament that these passages are important because they remind us that in the early church, it's very clear that women were integral and vital to the leadership of the early church in every level of leadership. So here's one where the women are prophesying, and there's another prophet that comes along and says, you really shouldn't do this, Paul. And Paul says, I have to go. I feel called to do this. I have to go. So arriving in Jerusalem, they meet with the church leaders. The Apostle Peter is not there anymore. And we don't really know what happened to Peter. He kind of makes an off-camera exit in the book of Acts. Now James is in charge, and James is apparently the biological brother of Jesus, and he's running the church of Jerusalem. So Paul reports on his work sharing the gospel with the Gentiles. He's like, I've been traveling around and things are going great. And then James also reports, they're colleagues. He reports to Paul, the gospel's been growing here in Jerusalem among the Jews. So both branches of the church, Gentile and Jew, are growing. But then the intrigue starts. James informs Paul that there are rumors that he is teaching Jews, that Paul is going around teaching Jews to reject the Jewish law and even to stop circumcising their baby boys. So these elders tell Paul to publicly perform some religious duty that shows everyone that he's a good Jew and that he supports his Jewish faith. And Paul does that. And near the end of that religious duty, which takes about 7 days, we get verse 27, which says, and then Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple. Grabbing him, they threw the whole crowd into confusion by shouting, fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, the law, and this place. And this place refers to the Jerusalem temple. So as a result, Paul's almost killed here by this angry mob until the Romans step in and arrest him. They actually protect him by arresting him in this situation. And as I've said, he'll be under arrest until the end of the book, if not for the end of his life. Okay, so getting to our theme, following Jesus while imprisoned by the world, today I want to reflect on one way that Paul navigates power in this passage. And it's happening actually right before he's arrested, as the threat of his arrest is imminent. I know despite some of the very serious examples I've already mentioned of ways that we live faithfully in less than ideal circumstances, this next one may seem like, oh, it's not the same level, but it really is, and it's serious, and it's gossip, as Billy was talking about in the sermon. Have you ever had someone gossip about you? Have you ever had someone talk about you behind your back? Can gossip be a power in the world that we have to navigate as we follow Jesus? Can gossip be a power that can limit us and harm us? Yes, yes to all those things. And again, it might seem small compared to family issues or economic issues or white supremacy and patriarchy, but it's a power. It's a power that can do us a lot of harm. And often we can feel powerless over what people are saying about us. And so we have to learn to live faithfully despite being in prison, but in a world that gossips. So what can we do? How do we follow Jesus while people gossip? I love this picture. I was supposed to show this picture earlier. It's a great gossiping picture, but why do they have little lace collars and why is this boy eating KFC? But anyway, that's my gossip picture. Okay, so the first thing we can do as we navigate all of this stuff is don't gossip ourselves. I know this is kind of obvious. Why do I have to say this? But we do. We need to be reminded. We can't control whether other people gossip, but we can control whether we gossip. And there are different ways that we gossip. The most obvious is whispering to someone that so-and-so did something scandalous or terrible, and aren't they such a terrible person for doing that? And aren't we so good for not doing that? Now, obviously, don't do that. But sometimes we try to soften our gossip by saying, well, we don't believe this terrible thing, but people are saying it, and isn't it terrible that people are saying it when we're actually also saying it? Don't do that. And then there's this other kind of gossip that happens in our story today that really masquerades as being helpful. The Jerusalem elders tell Paul to his face that other people are talking about him. So Paul needs to jump through these hoops of religious duty to prove the gossipers wrong. But do you see the problem here? These elders have the power to confront the gossipers. They had the power to put a stop to it. They could say to the gossipers, look, you're wrong. What you're saying about Paul is not true. He is our colleague, he is our friend, you are wrong. But they didn't say that. The great philosopher Jay-Z says, don't tell me what was said about me. Tell me, why were they so comfortable to say it to you? The elders in the church in Jerusalem don't use their power to speak up for Paul. They listen to the gossip and then they pass on what they heard to Paul and try to get him to do something about it. So part of not gossiping means that we stand up to the gossipers. We stop it in its tracks. We don't listen to it. We say that it's wrong. And still, even when we do that, that's not going to always stop people from talking about us. So the second thing we can do to try to live and navigate a world that gossips is to live with integrity. When Paul is asked to do this religious duty publicly, he doesn't object because he wants to do it, because he's a faithful Jew. He's like, of course I'm going to do this. I would do it anyway. Sometimes the best thing we can do when people are gossiping about us is just keep on living faithfully. Keep trying to follow Jesus. Keep trying to be the best person we can be. And still, people will talk, and people will gossip and even lie, which brings up the third and final way that we can address gossip, and that is to confront it head on. That's what Paul does at the end of this chapter and into the next. He asks permission of his Roman captors to address the rumors face to face with his accusers. And sometimes we need to do that. We need to confront people, and we need to do it with facts, and we confront the person who's gossiping about us. And remember that that may not be the only person involved either. It may be one person doing the whispering, but lots of people doing the listening. So sometimes our confrontation has to be to speak truth to the listeners of the gossip and hold them accountable for why they're not standing up for us, why they don't have our back. And all of that's uncomfortable. Confrontation is not pleasant, and it's going to upset the peace. And sometimes the peace seems like it's safer, even though it might be based on lies. But truth is truth, and our reputations do matter. And sometimes if we don't speak up for ourselves, no one else will. We are not going to live in a world without gossip. We are imprisoned by it. But we can follow Jesus in the midst of that world, despite those forces that seek to do us harm. When it comes to gossip, we navigate those forces by not gossiping, not contributing to the problem, not making it worse, by living publicly with integrity, despite what people might say about us. And we confront the powers of this world with our truth. We stand up for ourselves, we stand up for others. And standing up for truth, perhaps more than anything else that we do, is one way we follow the example of a man who stood up for the truth, even to the cross. Amen.